Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone to the third learning webinar series organized jointly by UN Women and Prevention Collaborative. Today's series is part of the 5 learning webinar we organized jointly with Prevention Collaborative on different topics that are related to violence prevention. We started with a conversation around violence against this intersection between violence against women and violence against children. And last week we had a conversation with 2 experts on preventing violence against women in humanitarian setting. And today the topic is on social norms and violence against women prevention. It's a topic that that come quite regularly in the field of violence against women prevention. There's several thought and questions around it. There's a very high interest on how we can change the norms that are barriers or are factors that drive violence, and how we can promote the norms that can be protective factors for addressing violence against women and girls. So today we are going to hear more from the 2 experts who can tell us more about this area of work. At UN Women, our current strategic plan has a specific outcome on social norm change, because we believe that social norm change is part of the key strategy to addressing gender inequality and disempowerment of women, and also part of addressing violence against women. So today we will have that conversation, and we are so happy to have the 2 experts who have very rich experience to share with us about this topic, what social norm means, what are the social norm change approaches, and how these approaches and strategy can be used in the field of preventions, and how we can use this to change belief, attitudes, and practices in order to address violence against women. So allow me to briefly introduce the 2 experts who will be leading the conversation today, and I can invite them to turn on their videos, Anjali and Lee. Anjali Kohli is an independent consultant working on gender-based violence and violence against children prevention, sexual reproductive health and right, and social norm. She is an implementation scientist with a focus on partnering and learning for practice. Welcome, Anjali. And Lee Stefanik is an independent consultant with 14 years of practical experience, specializing in gender integrations and gender-based violence prevention in international development programs. Prior to consulting, Lee worked as a gender advisor for CARE USA for 10 years, which including translating social norm theory into practice. Welcome, Lee. So we are going to have 90 minutes for this webinar. We would have almost about an hour for Lee and Anjali to guide us through the conversation on social norms and violence prevention. We would have about 30 minutes for Q&A. The Q&A functions is open, so please welcome to provide your questions for discussion with Anjali and Lee. So without further ado, over to you, Anjali, to start off. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm happy, Lee and I are both really happy to be here with all of you. And let's go to the next slide. So I'll just start off by giving us an overview of what we're going to cover today. So we're starting with some basics of social and gender norms, just to get us all on the same page in terms of how Lee and I, on behalf of the Prevention Collaborative, are thinking about this. And then we'll move on to thinking about, should we work on social norms, and present a few considerations that might be valuable. And then move on to how can projects shift norms, focusing on a few common strategies. And then we'll open up for discussion. So please do use the Q&A so you can keep track of the questions that are coming in. And then in the last few minutes before we close, we're going to spend some time talking about good practice when working on norms and violence against women to bring it all together. So I'll start us off with the basics. Next slide. So what are social norms? Let's go one more slide. Thanks. So social norms are often the implicit and informal rules that most people accept and abide by, right? So they're not these written down ideas of how the world should be or what people should do, but they're more informal. People understand them because they live within the environments in which they're happening. And they're influenced by belief systems, perceptions of what others expect and do, and sometimes by perceived rewards and sanctions, right? So that gives us a helpful framework of thinking about where they come from and how they develop and then how they act within a society. We also know that norms are embedded in formal and informal institutions and produced and reproduced through social interaction, right? So norms exist and operate because people enact them. And the more they enact them, the more entrenched they are. So people start to follow them even when they don't think that they're following them. And they exist across the layers of the socio-ecological framework. So it's not just about relationships or community, but also these institutions, our schools, our laws, our policies are embedding social norms, and they're acting on social norms, and they're reproducing them in the ways in which people operate. So next slide. Just another way of thinking about social norms. So they are what people in a group believe is typical, so what they think others do, and what is appropriate, so what is approved or expected behaviors. And they're different from attitudes or beliefs because they're about what is acceptable in a group setting. And so I'm going to give some examples of this just so we can see what those distinctions look like. So let's go to the next slide. So attitudes are what people, oops, sorry, I forgot there's a gender norm. So gender norms are a type of social norm, right? So social norm, there are social norms that define acceptable behavior, roles, entitlements, and gender expression for women and men in a given culture and social group. So we may see that gender norms are similar in different contexts, and they may be really embedded in culture and cultural practice. They're learned and reinforced from childhood through adulthood, through observation, instruction, sanctions, media, religion, right? So from a very young age, people are learning what the boundaries are of somebody of their gender or of a different gender. And those boundaries may shift as people move through their life course or their life stages. Perhaps as they age or they enter into marriage, the what is acceptable may start to change based on what roles they have. And gender norms we know can be so pervasive that people just often think of them as normal. Like, this is the way the world is constructed. There's no other way to be. And so unpacking and revealing gender norms can start to create opportunities to think about whether they should be the way they are. So next slide. So getting back to attitudes, we understand attitudes as they can be different from norms, but they can also really align with norms. So an attitude is what a person individually thinks is okay. And sometimes what they think is okay for themselves or for other people is the same as what the norm is. And sometimes it's quite different from the norm. So we want to start to understand, when do people agree with the norm that's in place? And when do their attitudes diverge from the norm? Because that can be a real opportunity for programming. If people's attitudes are different from the norm and both are influencing the behaviors in place, we might try and uplift attitudes as a way to start to think about, is there possibility of norm shift? Next slide. So a few examples. On the left-hand side, you see a couple of behaviors that are relevant to violence against women. So starting with the first one, men force or coerce their partners to have unwanted sex, right? So what would an attitude be that's associated with this? It could be, I think women should have the right to choose when to have sex with their husband, right? It's a personal opinion, belief about what you think should be possible. And a potential influential norm in that related to that behavior could be, most people in my community think men are entitled to have sex with their wife or partner whenever they want to, right? So here we can see that there's a bit of divergence between the norm and the attitude. Another example, I won't read them all, but another example is the second one. So intervening to stop violence. An attitude for this could be, I think I should intervene to stop violence. And the norm might be, others in my community expect me not to get involved in another family's affairs, right? So both of these attitudes and norms in this particular example are at odds with each other. So is there a possibility of shifting the norm of what's expected while uplifting the possibility for people to act on their attitudes? Next slide. Another concept that's important to social norms are reference groups. So we know reference groups are a group of people whose behavior and belief shapes one's own beliefs and behaviors, right? So these can be people who give advice, who define the boundaries of what's possible through sanctions or boards, people you go to for advice, or people who come to you and give you guidance on how to be, right? And so any one person in relation to any behavior might have multiple reference groups. So we're partially interested in who those reference groups are, and we're interested in how they influence behavior, right? Are there certain reference groups in specific situations that are more important or less important? Do the ways in which they enforce a behavior or enforce a norm have more importance or more consequences than other people? So how are people navigating their reference groups in relation to norms and behaviors? Next slide. And then we also need to understand that many factors influence behavior, right? So here we're focusing on norms in relation to violence against women because we understand that these norms are important to whether violence takes place, how it takes place, whether people intervene or not, and what the possibilities are to end violence. But we also know that there's other factors that we need to be considering because they're not necessarily the only factor that's important, nor are they necessarily the most important factor. So we want to keep in mind that there's individual factors such as attitudes, agency, beliefs, self-efficacy. There are social factors like norms and networks, structural factors, so these conflict dynamics, laws, ideologies, globalization, and many other. Those are just a few examples. And then material realities that can affect what resources people have access to, or the infrastructure they have access to. The next slide. So with that, I'll pass it on to Lee, who will talk about deciding to work on it.
We'll go back one slide first. Thank you. Thank you, Anjali, and hello, everyone. In the next couple of sections, I will touch on the following points: some considerations for deciding whether to work on norms, common norms related to violence against women, and some common strategies to shift norms. And I want to also say this is an exciting time to be presenting to you because the Prevention Collaborative is in the process of creating an online course on social norms and prevention of violence against women and children. So keep an eye out for that in the future. And we are looking forward to the discussion section when we can hear your questions and have a rich discussion. One more thing I want to say before I start is that I hope that at the end of this presentation, everybody says, oh, okay, that's pretty aligned with what I had in mind. So, what we're going to be doing, part of what we'll do today is to give you a bit of a framework about how to think about norms and violence and some strategies which hopefully will be familiar to you, and we'll think about how to do those in a way that can be a little more deliberate about layering and leveraging them together to shift norms. Next slide, please. So deciding whether to work on violence, excuse me, sorry, I'm clicking through too. Okay, so norms are often important, but they might not make sense for every intervention. Intervention should be informed by exploratory, formative research to understand what factors, including social norms, underlie why people do what we do, right? It's how you do it anyway. So here you could consider, what is the role, if any, of social norms in upholding a behavior or limiting alternative behaviors? So one rule of thumb is that if people behave in a certain way, in part because they expect social consequences if they didn't, this is an easy way to tell that a norm may be influencing their choices and actions, and that it's important to address. Social sanctions can include gossip, teasing, rumors, ostracism, or social exclusion, and these costs can be quite high. So think about, what is the goal you're trying to achieve, and do you think norms are critical to positive change? Here's an example where it makes sense to address a norm. If your goal is to encourage survivors to come forward for help, but everyone will shame them if they do, then that's a big problem. Will social pressure be so strong that it's going to interfere with change? And if so, we need to work on that. An example of when norms may not be a priority could be a human trafficking intervention. Now, there are probably norm-related behaviors involved, but what's really driving trafficking? Criminal elements, potentially, and huge economic incentives where women and kids are sent into situations under false pretenses that they're going to have paid work. Considering all the other factors, norms-based programming may not be the most strategic way to reduce trafficking. Another factor to consider for whether to work on norms is whether the broader macro-level context is favorable for social change. If not, it may be harder for norm change interventions to make or sustain progress. Some macro-level factors that would be more supportive for social change include the presence of a progressive government, an active civil and capable civil society, funded legal mandates about violence prevention, and a vibrant economy. Next slide, please. So some specific types of violence are remarkably consistent across contexts. So you don't need to identify them from scratch, some specific norms related to violence. Now, this is important because usually people devote a lot of effort to diagnosing norms. And what this means practically is that once you can identify these common norms, which are pretty much similar everywhere, you can instead focus on verifying and prioritizing the norms for your intervention. So let's walk through common norms that really show up everywhere for intimate partner violence. And then later we'll talk about common norms related to non-partner forced sex. And you can see what I mean about them being similar everywhere. And I guarantee every one of you on this call has heard the same thing over and over about these types of violence. So multiple norms affect any one practice. Norms that sustain partner violence include the tolerance of violence as a way to resolve conflict in a relationship. Violence is a private family matter and others should not intervene. A woman should not seek divorce even if her husband is abusive. And it's not acceptable for women to refuse sex with their husbands or partners. And expectations of female obedience and male authority in relationships. These norms fall into broad buckets around norms of family privacy and honor, gender norms, and norms on acceptability of violence, which I'll return to shortly. Some behaviors are norms themselves, like stopping at a red light. Those who fail to enact these norms face a negative response from others, creating a direct link between the behavior and the norm. Other behaviors like partner violence may not be norms themselves in that they may not be obligatory, but different norms may help sustain that behavior. So for example, community members may not approve of partner violence, but it is nonetheless sustained because it remains hidden in a shroud of silence by the norm of family privacy. Start by thinking about what behaviors you want to change for each type of violence in your program, so you can address the appropriate norms for each of those behaviors. So for intimate partner violence, consider not just acceptance of hitting one's wife, but also victim blaming, help seeking, so on. Next slide, please. The next few slides illustrate how norms for partner violence show up consistently across contexts. Here are some examples from qualitative research in Rwanda and Tanzania, where respondents consistently point to men's role as head of household and provider and social sanctions he would face for being seen as not following those norms. Quote, if a man's wife is the provider, the neighbors will think he's a fool, end quote. Recall that the expectation of social sanctions are an easy way to point out the presence of a norm. Similarly, a respondent from Tanzania also invokes men's authority as, quote, the way God created us men, end quote, showing how these norms are often seen as natural and fixed, and this makes them harder to change. More on that in the strategy section. Next. Next slide. Similarly, across context, next slide, please. Similarly, across context, gender norms often determine if violence is considered justified. Here on this slide, we see multiple examples of respondents reporting that hitting one's wife is considered justified if the wife does, quote, something wrong. And the reasons are usually about violating a norm around women's obedience or their expected role in the household. Next slide. Finally, these responses show some examples of social sanctions that women expect if they leave an abusive marriage or seek help. That would be an embarrassment or it's shameful to the woman and her family. And these reputational risks are very influential. And they show how norms of family honor and unity can trump individual well-being for women and how those norms keep them from leaving abusive relationships where violence can continue. Next slide, please. Let's look at the relationship between violence and norms in another way. Norms about gender and power often determine norms around when it's acceptable to use violence and against whom. The acceptability of physical violence is the combination of three things. One, the severity of the violence. So you can't go too far in how severe the violence is, or it would be deemed unacceptable. The problem is that the line, this threshold, accommodates quite a bit of physical violence. So it comes down to shifting that line over to not doing violence at all, not having it be acceptable in any form. Number two is the reason the violence is being used. And the reason can't be seen as arbitrary. As we just saw from the last slides, whether violence is justified, considered justified or acceptable, is often tied to transgressing a gender norm. The third reason is social position, which are the perceived rights of that person using the violence to discipline or control the other's behavior. So the same act of violence can be acceptable to use against someone's wife, for instance, but not their employer. And these acceptable thresholds are often based, again, on gender norms. Social norms on gender include that men have more power and authority over women in their relationships. You can reduce, not yet, sorry, keep going. You can reduce violence by moving the line on any of these areas, and you need to address all three. If you can shift norms around gender and power, you can make violence less acceptable. This acceptability threshold really plays out on violence in the home, including partner violence and childhood violence, where much family violence is a sanction for transgressing other norms, like who you should see, where to go, and how to act. Next slide. So here are some common norms related to another type of violence, forced sex by a non-partner. And these include that men are entitled to sex, women and girls should be responsible for making sure they don't tempt men's uncontrollable sexual urges, and that if a woman is raped, she should not report to police to protect her family and her family's honor, to protect her and her family's honor, excuse me. Recall that norms are linked to specific behaviors and outcomes. A project would select and address the specific norms linked to the behaviors it seeks to change. So to discourage victim blaming and improve quality of services for survivors, one would need to address norms of women's responsibility for controlling men's sexual urges, men's sexual entitlement, and norms of family honor and privacy. But you see, it's important to look at those behaviors and think about the specific norms that hold them up. Next slide. So to sum up, norms are linked to specific behaviors. So we start by identifying the behaviors you want to see change for a type of violence. Then select which norms are influencing those behaviors. Finally, we'll bring in the reference group piece. Identify the influential reference groups for each norm so you can engage them in activities and messaging. Remember, these are the people whose opinions and behaviors matter for someone else's behaviors. So we need to keep them in mind. We need to engage them in the same activities and be a part of that group process. Now let's move on to discuss common strategies for shifting norms in violence prevention programs. Next, yeah. You can stay here for a moment. Back a little bit, thanks. In this section, I will give you a list of illustrative strategies to shift norms in violence prevention programs, explain how they work, and provide some example activities for each strategy. Two things to know up front. Many of these activities and strategies are likely already familiar to you. Hooray! What is special in a norm change context is how these activities are combined and leveraged to advance key strategies known to be effective at shifting norms. In addition, frequently program designers and implementers have focused on strategies at the household and community levels to shift norms. But we're going to walk through ways to expand our toolkit to address gender socialization and norms in organizations and structures. We're going to pause now and do a quick poll if everybody can look at that way to do it on your screen. Norms exist in hearts, minds, and structures, and strategies need to shift norms across the social ecology. So what's your entry point for working on norms? Please use the poll to answer the prompt on the screen. Which level or levels describe where your organization is best placed to work on norms? And you can pick multiple levels, and then we'll look at the answers. Couple more seconds. Oh, very interesting. Okay, what a good split. Now, I guess it would be useful to know how many of you picked multiple, but it looks like based on these numbers, a lot of you picked multiple and it's pretty evenly distributed across the levels. So that's very good. And if you're not working at one of these levels, you can look at who's in the room and figure out who to partner with to address all the levels. So as with all violence prevention programming, if your intervention or organization doesn't work across all the levels, it's important to think similarly about norms to working in partnership with others so we can address norms across all the levels. All right, let's get to it. This is why you're all here. Illustrative strategies to shift norms. Next slide, please. The good news is we know that harmful norms can change. History has proven that. And what we want to try and do here is speed up this process where possible by applying what we know about how norms change and what holds them in place. So try and keep in mind some of those things we've been discussing, especially around the stickiness of gender norms being invisible, being hidden, being unchallenged. And we'll address some of that in the strategies. Next slide, please. Norms change when enough people choose to act or are compelled to act in a different way, creating a new norm. Regardless of what strategy you use, it has to be thoughtfully designed so that it's directly focused and related to the norm you want to change and the outcome you want to see. We're going to talk about a range of strategies that work to shift norms. The first is increased visibility of individuals who act against the norm. Catalyze deliberation about the appropriateness of a norm and its associated behaviors. Third, enhance support and reduce costs of acting against a norm. Fourth is catalyze organizational change. We'll unpack that. Fifth, encourage new behavior through laws and policies. And sixth, reinforce new cognitive pathways that associate different roles, capabilities, and behaviors with men and women. For example, employing more women in non-traditional jobs. These strategies can be used at different levels of the social ecology and are not mutually exclusive. So they can be combined and used to reinforce each other. And that's the point. So let's start by looking at each of these strategies and giving some examples. Next, please. This strategy is to increase the visibility of people engaging in positive behaviors or who have already changed their behavior. Another common term is positive deviance. So how it works is that people within a group or community see that not everyone agrees with or follows the norm and that alternatives are possible. And that piece is key. People also see that it becomes more common to act outside the norm as they see more examples of people around them or in their world acting outside of the norm. So things that seemed fixed and unquestioned before now you open it up to new possibilities, new images, new ideas. Activities for this are familiar to you and they include role modeling, public testimony about one's personal change or one's personal behavior, community theater, mass media portrayals of alternatives to the norm, or public declaration. So a whole village coming together to publicly declare that they abandon female genital cutting, for instance. This strategy tells us that to shift norms, we want to focus our messaging on the positive aspirational future we want to see and try and normalize that, rather than really focusing in on how common the problem is. So for example, the way this really plays out and looks different in our communications materials is trying to make sure our images represent the norms we want to see, as opposed to always talking about how common the problem is. So instead of 1 in 3 women experience violence as being the main message, you might say 4 out of 5 men in your community, have never hit their wives, if you have that data. But the point is to make sure that you have this helping to normalize and make more common that new aspirational positive alternative. So you can try this out pretty easily as well by reviewing your own communication images and messages for examples where you may subtly reinforce existing norms that you're trying to change. You can see if you can encourage new norms instead. So are women always depicted doing childcare? Can you feature an alternative instead? These are all of the different channels and ways that these images get reinforced in everyone's daily life from birth. We'll talk more about that from later. So we have to insert where we can alternatives. The second strategy, next slide please, is to catalyze deliberation about the appropriateness of a norm and its associated behaviors. This is also a common strategy many of you use where deliberation refers to encouraging reflection about what norms exist in a setting, whose interests they serve, and what are the consequences of existing norms for individual and collective well-being. It works by making the norm explicit, naming it, and reflecting on whether it aligns with core values. A goal is to help people see that norms are constructed and can therefore be changed. Deliberation, these group processes can reveal that not everyone agrees with a norm and allow a group to come together and change what they consider to be appropriate behavior. Reflection done in a group should be with members of one's reference group, should include members of one's reference group, so people can see and change together what the group considers to be appropriate behavior with this important group that somebody has in their mind when they're deciding how to behave. Activities that can encourage deliberation include critical reflection groups, edutainment, and mass media or role modeling alternative behaviors, followed by discussion, and radio listening groups. So some of these methods present the alternative, give a different sort of narrative and a story, and then it's about the group still discussing and deciding whether that's if they'd like to take forward any new agreements based on those ideas. You can also add specific examples for topics of deliberation that lead to violence prevention. In fact, that's what you would do. So some of those examples are, why are women blamed for rape and not the perpetrator? What does safety mean in a family? And what should happen if someone's being hurt? So you come up with different topics to challenge some of these norms and deliberate around them, that link back to core values within the community. Now, an important element of using this strategy for norm change is the concept of organized diffusion, which refers to how an idea or change, in this case, ideas about norms, spreads out beyond the core group in this deliberation to the whole community or society, which is what's required for shifting the norm at this group level. Evidence suggests that you need thoughtful planning to make this happen. So it's very important that you include strategies to reinforce reach. Now, this can be done through community engagement, immersive theater, media, and practice and training for individuals on how to have transformative conversations with multiple other people in their reference group about these norms. So it's not just spreading information awareness, it's about spreading these conversations in a way that replicates that sort of deliberative discussion, critical reflection process. And that requires specific training and practice. Next strategy, please. Another strategy is to focus on enhancing social support and reducing social costs that people will face or expect when acting against a norm. Projects can work to ease the path of more people to break from the norm and feel supported in doing so. So this strategy works by helping people change their behavior together at times because it's easier to be different in a crowd. So empowerment-only strategies put a lot of the costs of going against the norm on the individual. So you can add support for women's bravery by collectivizing that change. So she doesn't have to be the sole fulcrum of change, the only person putting herself out there. So this can include changing people's incentives and increasing social support and addressing backlash. This strategy seeks to clear the social barriers or minimize them for enough people to change their behavior so that it becomes more common or accepted to act outside the norm. Activities include connecting people who want to break norms to act together. So groups of girls playing sports in public, groups of women walking around the community, taking these visible actions outside of norms in groups so they can do that together. engaging power holders and allies to publicly support people who change, and public recognition and awards. Next. So catalyze organizational change. We're going to unpack this a little bit. Interventions can do this by using all the same strategies to shift norms, but applied at the organizational level. This includes holding critical reflection with influential people in the organization, enforcing new behaviors by changing policies and incentives, modeling new behaviors for individuals, and engaging with influential leaders for support. All these things are important. Now, the main point here is that typically when we talk about changing norms and practices within the organization, the go-to strategy is training. For instance, training on women's rights, on violence, but training is not the only mechanism for change. And we have to think more expansively by digging into our toolkit for some of these other strategies and applying them at this group of people and at this structure at this level. Example activities include adopting policies and protocols that incentivize and enforce new behaviors. So for instance, changing the evaluation criteria in a job description. Also engaging religious leaders to seek alignment of new norms with existing values. That's something that to work with these religious leaders at an institutional level. Next slide. Okay, laws can affect behavior by enforcing boundaries and communicating the boundaries of acceptable behavior. However, the way laws and policies function depends on the distance between the law and the norms that are dominant within a community and within institutions. And the law can encourage further normative shifts when the distance between the two is not so great. However, when it's really big, it can backfire. So people don't enforce the laws because they don't believe in it, and it can drive the practice underground. For instance, female genital cutting, or it can underline the rule of law in general. If you have these laws and policies on the books that are they're so different from the norms at a community level, and they just don't even get put into place. So law reform is a good strategy when community and institutional norm change is already underway. And to rely on law change as a mechanism, to rely on laws and policies as a mechanism for social change, it's important to think about how far the distance is between the law and social support for the laws, and then to publicize the law, develop a whole campaign to help people understand that the rules have changed, and most people actually miss that opportunity. For example, a comparison study between Sweden and Germany, which both outlawed corporal punishment at different points, demonstrated that laws alone are insufficient to induce change without efforts to publicize them widely, catalyze public debate, and teach alternative forms of discipline. So it's important to think about laws and policies not on their own as a norm shifting strategy, but in combination with other strategies, all pulling in the same direction. The last strategy I'm going to talk about here is around gender socialization, essentially. So there are opportunities to shift norms at an individual level by establishing new cognitive associations about gender. So remember, gender norms are a type of social norm, and the reason I'm pulling them out here is because they can be really sticky and resistant to change because they're held in place by deeply held, repeatedly reinforced cognitive schema. So pathways that are laid down in the brain about men, women, boys, and girls. And these schema are learned and reinforced from childhood through adulthood, through every manner of channel, through observation, instruction, positive and negative sanctions, the workplace, schools, families, religious and social institutions. And research shows that gender schema, these cognitive schema about gender, are some of the strongest associations that exist because they're reproduced from the start of one's life. But they can change. So the way to change these is they can be rewired by laying down new pathways of thinking and associations that start to replace the old ones. There are ways to help socialize these new patterns through parenting programs, school-based programs, and how media depicts things. So you try to infiltrate basically all the ways and channels that these associations about gender norms get socialized and reinforced starting early in one's life. And it is a long-term strategy. The main thing about this is to create the notion of a possibility of change and to get people to start to imagine things they never saw before. So some activities for this include providing countervailing images in media and with role models. An example of this at a macro level is a policy that some countries have taken on that ban gender stereotyping in ads. So changing those images at this level throughout a country can be a very useful policy. Promoting less gender rigid toys and books. Working with parents to model more flexible gender roles in household division of labor and childcare, and reforming gender biased institutions and organizations such as schools and workplaces. These are all examples of some of the channels that we need to start re-establishing new cognitive associations about gender. Next slide, please. So one question that is pretty common is, what are the longer term structural shifts that have really facilitated norm change over the long term? Now, different groups have devoted a lot of time to this, and we don't have time to really unpack all of the pieces here, but I want to point out a few key things that you can walk away with in your mind. These kinds of changes aren't on a project timeline, but if a country is thinking about positive shifts and transformational norms, it's really about policies that relate to women's entry to the labor market, secondary and tertiary education for girls, parental leave and caregiving support, especially for fathers, women's control over their fertility, women and girls' control over their fertility, and reforming discriminatory inheritance and family laws. We can reasonably say that these are linked to longer term structural shifts that will have normative implications. And these are things we don't think about as norm strategies, but probably do have a reciprocal relationship when it comes to facilitating norm change. So norm shift helps create the conditions for them, and laws and policies can support norm change itself. I'm going to close this section with a pause for a poll. Would love to hear which strategies we've just discussed you use in your own programming. Select as many as apply. Again, these are hopefully familiar to you, and using them for norm change is about how they're combined and leveraged to shift specific norms tied to behavioral outcomes across the social ecology. So we're thinking about what in our toolkit could we use to really leverage change in a more specific and deliberate way. And we'll look at some of these strategies next, but let's see what you say in your poll. All right. Can we take a peek, Johanna? Oh, wow. Interesting. If we were having discussion, I'd be asking if this is what you expect. It looks pretty even. Increased visibility. It looks like most of you are doing that one, which I'm happy to see. To me, that's the one that always resonated the most with me, as something that is a little bit different from maybe the way I was thinking about doing programming, but that can have a really big impact. Deliberation is about the same as costs and support, organizational change, laws and policies, and reinforce new cognitive pathways. So it looks like these resonate with what you're already doing. And hopefully what we can do now is just look at how these work together and how they can be combined and leveraged and tied to specific norms, tied to specific behaviors, and just think about that in a little bit of a sharper way to help you do what you're already doing. So next, I'll hand it back over to Anjali. She can walk through some strategies in a project example. Thank you.
Thanks, Lee. And so next, let's go to the next slide. So I'm going to go through one project example, Parivartan for Girls. It's a sports and mentoring program that took place in India. It was designed and implemented by Strive at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, ICRW, and Upnalaya in India. Let's go to the next slide. So the program is founded on the idea that restrictions on girls' liberty to move freely in public spaces contributes to school dropout, early marriage, and negative health and well-being from adolescence to adulthood. These restrictions include not only not allowing adolescent girls to socialize in public spaces, participate in certain activities, including sports, or socialize with boys. Girls typically have more responsibilities in the home. So even when they go to school, they're expected to return home and take care of different chores or responsibilities that they have. In this setting, popular discourse associates women's safety with the modesty of their clothing. Family honor is also rooted in girls' and women's bodies. This means that they're socialized to fear not only potential violence in public spaces, but also the threat of public censure that will impact their reputation. The fear of sexual harassment maintains male privilege and diminishes women's feelings of safety and belonging in public spaces and restricts their freedom of movement. So we can see that these norms are enforced through self-surveillance, meaning that girls themselves start to control their own movement or limit their movement in society, including who they talk to, where they talk to people, and what times of day they're out and about. And then their own movement is also policed by other people observing their adherence to what's expected of them and reporting back to their parents or directly reprimanding girls when they deviate from the expected norm. Next slide. So Parivartan had two basic program objectives. They wanted to know if a sports-based program for adolescent girls ages 12 to 16 years in a low economic community in Mumbai could shift norms that restrict girls' liberty to move freely in public spaces, and at the same time increase their self-esteem, self-confidence, and educational aspirations. So next slide. So the program had four main strategies. The first part being mentorship. So they identified relatively progressive young women from the communities who served as mentors to the girls. They were trained as mentors. They participated in gender reflection sessions themselves before starting mentoring. They received support throughout, and then they also coached the sports program called Kabaddi. So this gets back to that idea of partially of visibility, right? So picking people who are already deviating from the norm to guide other girls in this program. The second piece was this gender curriculum. So once a week for 1.5 hours each week over the course of 15 months, girls participated in a mentorship program. And the sessions alternated between talking about different types of self-reflection and group reflection and topics. So they talked about emotions, goal setting, gender equality, puberty, responding to violence. So a range of subjects that were relevant to girls in their lives. And at the same time, on a weekly basis, they had a 2-hour sports game that they played. And that whole program culminated in a public tournament where the whole community was invited. And then they involved parents and community. So they had different parents groups that would process different sessions themselves with a facilitator on different topics like communication with your daughter, the importance of girls' education. And then they had a community advisory board that guided them throughout this whole process. And there were some nuances. So they really had to think carefully about which girls got recruited into the program and how did they deal with parent consent for girls to participate. In many households, both parents were supportive of girls participating, but in some households, fathers were more reluctant than mothers. And so mothers navigated this themselves, proposing to the program that when the mother was willing to take the risk for the daughter should participate. And for other families where the risk was too high, mothers said, I'm not going to let my daughter participate at this moment, but maybe there's a future opportunity. So they were navigating their own norms and expectations while figuring out what felt safe to them in terms of their daughter's participation. Another key element was the program had to think about where the sports program took place. So it's not typical for girls to be involved in sports, much less gathering or being seen playing sports. So that could have been a spectacle in the community and something that people responded to negatively. So they decided to hold the program within a school compound that was walled. So people in the community couldn't actually see that girls were participating in the sports program, but they did on a weekly basis see girls moving in a group back and forth to the school. So they got used to the idea that girls are out and about and that they were participating in sports without having to watch it until enough time passed that it started to feel more normal. So what did they learn from this program? I see a few things here. One is sports with reflective sessions for girls and parents can be transformative. There has been a debate previously on whether sports can do this, but what they saw was that when a curriculum also facilitates this discussion with this mentorship, it can build camaraderie and confidence for girls in a group setting that allows them to act in ways that might not be acceptable as individuals or may feel too risky. They also built and implement programs with trusted, local, and community embedded partners. So recognizing that such a program really couldn't have been implemented without local partners who really understood the need, the context, the way it should be implemented, and took a lead on forming a lot of these different groups and thinking about what's acceptable here and what are the ways in which we navigate norms. They invested in those communities most ready for change. So they didn't try and tackle everybody in the community. They didn't say we have to bring everybody along right now, but they said, where are these opportunities to work with people who are ready to start this type of program? And maybe over time that will seep into the rest of the community. They also fostered collective agency in order to foster individual agency. So recognizing that asking girls to do something different as individuals was putting a lot of risk on them. But as a group, when they moved for example, when they moved through the community as a group of girls going to their weekly meetings, it suddenly felt less risky because they were together and they were doing something that was agreed by their parents as acceptable. And then they made this change visible in day-to-day interactions. So people started to see them, they got used to the idea of girls moving about, and it became normalized such that by the end of the program, when they held this tournament, the sports tournament, it could be held publicly and was considered more acceptable and less shocking. So with that, that's the program example I wanted to share. And now Lee and I have saved time so we can open it up for discussion. We have about 25 minutes for discussion, and then I'm going to close out with some good practices. So maybe I don't know, Lee, if you've had a chance to look at the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Anjali and Lee, for that. I can run through the Q&A quickly for both of you to respond. Questions: how do we get any of the information to achieve or even understand norm in a place without literacy as well as safe space to talk? Is there any comment on that? I can repeat, how do we get any information on shifting or understanding norm in places without literacy as well as a safe space to talk about that? Maybe perhaps in a very...
So is this the research question? Is this about formative research about norms, or is this around deliberation, like talking about norms as a strategy?
From my understanding, it would be a research question on understanding norm and a formative research to understand norm before starting the intervention or designing intervention. Right.
So the interesting thing about norms, especially from a research perspective, is that a lot of times you're talking about what generally is accepted or not in your community, as opposed to a lot of violence. A lot of research focuses on people's individual experiences or attitudes about violence, which is more prone to respondent bias. So people don't want to say that they think they're going to have a negative reaction to the response. As a respondent, they might actually say a more favorable attitude or behavior to the research team. So for this piece, you're actually asking about, in general in this community, what is expected, what is common, what is typical. We didn't get into measurement so much here, but the piece around asking around social sanctions is still done in a very general way. And people are usually pretty open to describing what would be expected in terms of a negative backlash if someone were to go against a norm in a non-individual or non-personal way. So I think that gets around a little bit the safe spaces to talk. These aren't people's personal experiences. And the literacy, I think we are all really big supporters of qualitative research on all of these things, and as opposed to trying to do a survey that you have to read and respond to answers. So if I'm understanding the question correctly, those would be my answers.
Yeah, I would just add, building on what you said about the qualitative research, Lee, is that there's a lot of participatory methods that can help us identify norms and sanctions. So people have used vignettes or 5 whys or the problem tree as a way to start to unpack what's typical or what are the underlying factors related to behavior, and then to use specific scenarios to really get at some of those pieces.
Thank you, Lee and Anjali. There are a few questions around how to work on social norm change in a context where religious ideologies or religious belief are not supporting that, or very and actually are opposing that. Do you have any example or any reflections on working in this challenging context?
I can start us off. I would say a couple of things. So one, it's true that there can be religious leaders or other leaders that have a narrative that can promote harmful norms, but there might also be protective norms that exist that are a place of opportunity. So when thinking about violence against children, for example, there's often norms also about the well-being of the family, the safety of the child, their ability to be raised in a safe environment, that are places that could be openings for conversation about what those things really mean to people, and can that be a focus of a program. Another thing I would say is good practice in a lot of these programs is starting out doing transformative work with the people who are actually part of these deliberations. So a starting point might be doing some transformative work with religious leaders themselves before getting deeper into a program, so that they have a chance at self and group reflection to see where their values and beliefs align.
One thing I would add to that is I've been hearing more as well in certain places where religion is, well, it's mostly this way, very hierarchical. And so even if you really work intensively with religious leaders in a certain community or region, sometimes you get to a point where they just say, look, you need to talk to the head of this religious institution, and they need to give me the green light to be able to talk about these norms in a different way or align with our values in a slightly different way that would be supportive of new behaviors. So I think also thinking about the hierarchy and the power structures in place within religious institutions is incredibly important, because you might be hit up against a wall where you need to actually look at the power within the institution and make sure you're engaging across those different levels in order to even engage with religious leaders in a local or more community level.
Thank you. There are also a few questions, Anjali and Lee, on unwanted sex with husbands, or rape within marriage. In many contexts, it's not treated as violence against women, or it's quite accepted because of the marriage situation. Have there been any example or case studies of work to address this type of belief and norms, to address rape within marriage?
Yeah, I can start. So I think this is such a great question to really put the spotlight on why norms are so important for some of these different types of violence, is that you have these bundles of norms about men's sexual entitlement, about women obeying, as being so central to what people think is a natural order. So unpacking some of those things around power and how power is used to coerce is a strategy that's been used in several projects. I'd say, SASA being the most commonly cited and really the leader in that space, to start as a place where it's not something that's not seen as violence, could be an entry point to discussing it by talking about differences in power, which everyone can relate to, and how those differences can be exploited to use power over other people to get them to do things they don't want to do. So I think one of the ways is to think about alternative entry points. If something's not seen as violence, to talk about it using more broader language that can bring people to the table to talk about those norms and like why things are the way they are. And that would be the project that I'd cite for that. And then also just my second piece is really the importance, I think, of those that those cognitive schema about what men are entitled to do, about what women have to do. It becomes all the more important from just these from a gender roles perspective early on in life and throughout every channel, can help to disrupt some of those pathways because they are so deep.
Yeah, one thing I would also add to that is there's some couples curricula that include content on emotional connection or talking with your partner, creating space for conversations they might not be having. And some of them deal directly with sex and sexuality and women asking for sex when they want it and men listening to their wives. And sometimes I've seen in some qualitative research that it opens space for men to start seeing their partner as a person with preferences and needs and choice. And we've heard, I don't know if this has been shown quantitatively, but we've seen qualitatively that it creates a little bit more space of thinking about sex as more playful and consensual.
Thank you. Interestingly, specifically on program design and intervention design, Lee and Angeli, there are also a number of questions related to funding and how to approach donors. One is that how, because there's a range of intervention or strategies that we can choose from, how do we convince donors or funders on specific strategy to use? And secondly, oftentimes many organizations experience the very tight time frame and tight budget for violence prevention programs and projects, and that wouldn't allow us to do a thorough long-term social norm change work, including the inability to put in a very good normative, formative research at the beginning of the project to understand norms. So what would be the strategy to address these different challenges from funding and program management perspective?
Those are great questions and very difficult to tackle. I think I'm not sure how to get donors to come along. I think there's a lot of advocacy going along with donors to really try and be realistic about what's achievable within a program timeline, as well as building more time in upfront for program planning and design and adaptation as you implement. I think those are particular opportunities in this field, is like not being so fixed to one way programs can look and allowing them to evolve as the situation evolves. And I was going to say something else, but it just slipped my mind. So I'll pause and see if Lee has.
Yeah, I think there's a couple different things to take away from that is, you know, you can go into different levels of depth on the research and the diagnostic of norms. There's lots of options. So I think it's, you know, being aware that there's a range of rigor that you can apply to the measurement piece, the diagnostic piece, and it's okay to tread lightly. We have, I mean, the most important thing is that we have some ideas from strategies that are already familiar to you, that you already have experience in, and most people have a lot of capacity in that. And we already know the common norms. So, you know, you can lightly sort of verify these norms are present in your community and in your setting, and then prioritize them based on the behaviors you really want to see change. And you can take donors through that process of just how you're thinking about doing this in a bit of a deliberate way. And I think that's mostly what they want to see. They want to see some thought behind it, some criteria for how you're going about doing it, and then explain how your capacities and your strategies are being combined and leveraged to work on norms across the socioecological level, like across all people's lives. And in terms of the time frame, it's being very upfront that norms can change quickly. I mean, you think about texting, that changed pretty quickly for a norm. And then some norms are going to be can be more protracted and slow. So what you want to think about in your project time frame is what pieces are you putting in place from the strategies we know that work? How are you working and combine them? And in the short term, it's really important to have this intensity and consistency around targeting specific norms with different strategies. And that's what you want to do in the short term. And then you can have the long-term strategies that are also a part of your work, but communicating to donors that in the short term, this is what you're focused on, and you're going to qualitatively understand maybe if the process is getting stuck anywhere through your monitoring, but also to not expect red light, green light norms changing in a 1 or 3 year project period. Like, it's not realistic. So I just say expectation setting, understanding norms in a qualitative, what do we do about it sort of way as your project's being implemented, and combining the strategies, having like a deliberate approach that you can articulate to donors.
And there's a question related to that, Lee. What would be the recommended minimum duration for intervention that can be considered as sufficient to change social norm? And also, what would be the recommended minimum duration to measure social norm change after the intervention?
Anjali, if you have any specific, I mean, I have some thoughts, but one thing I'd say, if you can get funding for research after the intervention is ended, it would be great, because that's not done enough. And that's what you really want to see, is have the pieces you've put into place been able to sustain themselves? Has the community taken it up? Or is the clockwork in motion, and does it continue after the process, the intervention ends? So if you can do a research after the fact, 3 or 5 years, that'd be great. Love to see more of that. And I forget the first question. While I remember it, maybe Anjali, you can jump in.
Yeah, this question comes up a lot in terms of how much time is sufficient to change norms and to sustainably change norms to have a long-term effect, and at what point you should be measuring them. And I think, I think the evidence isn't there. I think we know that norms can be shifted in a short period of time, and it works better, like Lee was saying, when we're very clear about the strategies and how they're connected to each other. Which strategies are trying to shift norms, which strategies are trying to do other things, how are they complementing each other? So thinking about program theories of change and what we expect to see can help us think about what's feasible in a certain period of time. But there's no fixed time that people have been able to pinpoint, like in 3 years, this norm should be able to change. I just don't think we're quite there yet. But what I think more should be happening in terms of data collection is that we should be using a lot more of our data during program implementation. So what are those early signs of norm shift that can give us an indication that we're having an effect, right? And that we want to shift norms in order to have an effective behavior. So are we starting to see less sanctions? Are we starting to see possibilities of people to act differently that can tell us we're moving in a direction rather than waiting till these endpoints to say, did norms shift?
Thank you. Many questions are coming, so I'm trying my best to select and try to group them, because it would be very hard for us to go through every question. And thank you so much for this active questioning. Another group of questions that I can point out, it's related to men and boys and also masculinities when we're talking about social norms. So there are questions about how we work on addressing harmful masculinities or impunity of violence perpetrations by men, how we work with young men and boys, especially with this world of digital connections. I think we also have heard, I don't know if we have followed the news recently around Andrew Tate, on how digital or online platforms have been used to promote certain forms of harmful masculinities that promote violence against women, misogyny, and gender discriminations. So do you have any example or any thought to share about how to work specifically on gender norms around how to be men or among men and boys?
Go ahead, Anjali. I was thinking about some of the Passages projects, if you have anything top of mind from that learning.
Yeah, I can. Yeah, sure. So I don't think the strategies are that different in terms of what we're doing with men and boys. I think a lot of these dialogue-based strategies of unpacking what people's beliefs are, what the norms are, getting people into dialogue to self-reflect, creates opportunities for change amongst boys and men in the same way it does for girls. It just might be that there are times where you want to keep people gender separate, and there might be times where you want to bring people together in order to have safety and dialogue and conversation. I think making visible different behaviors for boys is really important. It gives them space to think and act differently and to see what the possibilities are. And then touching on, Kim, what you said about technology, I think the evidence I've seen is really nascent. I think there's a lot of concern about how what's happening on social media can rapidly shift norms, hopefully in a good direction, but sometimes very regressively, and entrench these ideas. And I think people are trying innovative strategies to think about what to do with them. I saw a news article about teachers in the UK starting dialogue sessions in schools, specifically about Andrew Tate and boys' engagement with this kind of media, because they realized they couldn't dodge the topic anymore because too many youth thought it was normal and good behavior. So I don't know where that'll go, but something to keep in mind.
There's specific, Lee, go ahead.
No, I was just looking through the questions. There's so many, it's hard to read them and pick and pay attention. So if you have one that, and these are great. I mean, I'd like to save all these questions as well. And I'm sorry we can't get to them all, but please go ahead. If I'll type an answer to some if I can.
Yeah, there are specific questions for you, Angela and Lee. So I can just hand pick them out. One question to Anjali. You spoke about advisory group at community level in the intervention. Can you tell more about the members and role of this advisory group in the project? And there are two more for Lee, but I'll let Anjali answer this and I'll come back to you, Lee.
Sure. So I'm not sure if I remember exactly what the community advisory role was. So I believe that they were involved in the intervention design. So thinking about how it should be structured, thinking about recruitment of girls and parents and about safety. But I can look back to the project materials and share it with you, Ken, afterwards if you want to circulate that.
There's one question here that I think is interesting. Well, they're all interesting, but this is one that is in front of my face. So regarding the visibility strategies from Christine, regarding the visibility strategy, such as public declarations, sometimes people publicly display that they're against a particular harmful social norm, yet maintain private support for the same. How do we address this? So I think that's a really interesting question. There's a couple ways to think about that. One is that there's just sort of two ways that norms can change. One is that you get a critical mass of people who are changing their minds, discussing, making new rules together. You get enough people changing in that way. Or you can, behavior sometimes come first. It's not always just that norm change is the leading cutting edge to behavior change. So, you know, if those public displays are still useful, it shows that a lot of people are showing up and kind of deciding that this is the rule that they don't want to have. So even if people privately may not be there yet, there's still a value in that group visibility of others around you coming forward and saying that they're against something like this. So I'd say there's still value there. And then it comes down, I think, also to that, what other factors are going on, you know, lurking? Are there economic incentives? Like, it's not just norms that keep people from personally disagreeing or agreeing with a practice. So this is part of a broader comprehensive program. And I think you'd look at some of those things that are holding people back. But if their personal attitude is different, that's a different strategy than what the norms shifting strategies are trying to do, which is to change the group rule about what's acceptable or not. So you're still going to use the usual strategies. If you need to raise awareness, if you want to increase knowledge on what services exist and provide transportation on how to get there, you still have a comprehensive set of strategies for other things besides norms that you need to keep in mind, which you will keep in mind.
You have anything to add, Anjali, or we can go to the next one?
No, please go ahead.
There's questions on social norm change interventions or work, especially linking to preventing violence against women in humanitarian setting. The questions, it's around how normally this work is happening more or less in development setting, and understanding the humanitarian setting, the context changes quite rapidly, and the social and economic and political institutions and structures are not as stable as in development setting. So how do we work on social norm change in that changing context as a strategy to prevent violence against women?
So I think one thing to keep in mind about these sort of disruptions like an emergency is that often norms can get suspended in their regular way that they unfold, because you have to migrate for work, you lose your social contacts, or everything gets disrupted. People have to fall into different roles to survive, or in other ways. And so one popular narrative is that there's a lot of opportunity in that change to make new agreements about norms that work in the new environment. What you see though a lot is that once things settle down and people enter into a more stable period, you have a lot of these norms then resurfacing and reasserting themselves, which can be associated with higher levels of violence as these things get reintroduced, as gender norms about male authority and who does what and who makes decisions and who gets to work outside the home try to be reinforced. So it is a time when there's a risk of violence associated with these shifting norms, as well as opportunity. So I think thinking about some of those things and putting into place some of this deliberation about what are some of the agreements we want to have in our new environment, and keeping the channels open for how people reconcile and discuss those agreements about who does what, and those expectations can be a really useful thing in these situations of upheaval, like in emergency settings. And also, I would say that the visibility piece is important as well, as seeing, if somebody adapts, you see examples of different families who end up sharing roles and decision-making more, and how they might prosper or do well in this shifting, challenging environment because they've done that. So visibility of people who are disrupting some of these more rigid norms about power and authority and who can do what, and raising up how that's behooved them or helped them in these situations can also be effective. So I'd say the strategies work across contexts. It's about thinking about how are norms affected by this upheaval, by the changing situation, and where are there opportunities, and where are there also risks that we have to keep in mind for how norms and violence play out in those settings.
Yeah, just one small thing I would add to that is, I think coming back to that idea of working as a collective. So where are there opportunities in those settings to create community and bring people together, so that it's not just thinking about like a family structure or a unit of individuals, but people as a group creating opportunities to change. Because as those spaces start to shift, you might be able to think about collective action or collective dialogue. Kim, I know we wanted to also end with some good practices. So I don't know if you want to do one final question, or we should move to the good practices.
Yes, maybe two quick final questions, but quite difficult questions. Then we can hand over to you for ending the presentation. One is that if you can speak more around addressing institutional social norms, like how social norm carried out by institutions, and then how they are promoted by institutions, for example, political, religious, or even economic and educational institutions, and how we can work on addressing these institutional norms. Secondly, there's a few complex questions on a very complex issues about the intersectionality between among different power imbalances. How do we address gender norms in relations to other norms that promote other types of inequalities? How that will link to racism, homophobia, ageisms, and other different forms of oppressions, because social norms link different inequalities together. So how can an interventions address gender norms that promote violence, but at the same time other norms and socio-economic factors that can be underlying factors for inequality? So can you speak to these two very complex questions, and then over to you for finalizing your presentation. Thank you, Angeline Lee. Angeline Lee.
Thanks, Cam. Before I forget the last question, because it was a long one, I'm just going to speak to it briefly. So I think that we've been talking a lot about gender norms because we're talking about violence, but some of these same cognitive schema about race, caste, ethnicity, social standing, these apply as well. So I would just say, the power of seeing alternatives throughout one's life and in family, in school, in the media, in books, in toys cannot be overstated. Like, it's just so important to be able to see alternatives to some of these negative stereotypes that just overwhelm people's way of thinking about certain groups. So I think that one is just really important, and it starts early. It starts from childhood, right from the beginning, and gets reinforced throughout. So I would point to that piece there as applying to other norms around status and power for any marginalized groups. And oh, no, I was afraid I was talking fast, so I wouldn't forget. I'll leave it Anjali up there if she remembers.
Well, I'll add to the intersectionality one. I think the other thing is to remember that not all people have the same options of behavior or the same opportunities to deviate from expectations, right? So getting at the consequences for some people can be so much harder than on other people. And so programmatically, I don't have specific recommendations, but I think we really need to keep that in mind, that even when we're talking about gender norms and the possibilities of men's behavior across all men, it's just not the same, right? So how do we start to create space for people to change safely? Is something to think about. And Lee, the other question, I think you might be better placed than me, was about institutions.
Oh yeah, what was it though exactly? What so okay, one, I think I remembered I was thinking when you were talking. One thing that is important to think about with institutions is that with these sort of groups or I'll talk about organization and institutions similarly, there's always a set of influential individuals within them who can be a good point of entry for looking at setting standards and norms and influencing the behavior and practices throughout this broader body. So when I gave that example of the religious leaders at the top of an organization kind of giving the green light to others under them to behave in certain ways, the thinking about power within these institutions, and is there an entry point with these influential individuals to use our social norm shifting strategies to change their behavior by shifting their incentives, critical reflection on these values that they think they're fulfilling with the current norms that maybe they could fulfill better with different norms. The same strategies, role modeling within an organization, holding up organizations, I keep saying organization, institutions that are actually interpreting and modeling behaviors in a different way and modeling different norms. That can be another piece to do with these institutions. So I think thinking about the individuals as an entry point, using some of those same strategies at this level, and then also thinking about just how norms show up in the different ways that people are incentivized also within these organizations. Can you change some of their policies, incentive structures for how they do their jobs, for who they reach out to when they do their extension activities with the community? These are all ways that we can think about institutional change, but honestly, this isn't my strongest area. And so I think there's been a lot of really good writing on that. We can link some of it in there, but those would be my thoughts off the top of my head.
So with that, maybe I can close out with some good best practices. Can we go back? Can we go to the next slide? I won't go through each of these. One more slide. But I do want to highlight them. That I think they'll be reinforced from what we've just discussed in the discussion and the earlier presentation. But when we're thinking about norms and broad programming, we want to strengthen and amplify protective norms that build on existing cultural values. So there can be a tendency to look at what's harmful, what's negative, what's not working well. But there are also protective norms about people's responsibility to each other, their values that can be opportunities to leverage. And so we don't want to forget that. Another thing is to focus on the multiple drivers of violence against women and provide support services for survivors. So keeping in mind, like we said earlier, that norms is just one piece of this puzzle. And so we don't want to think about norms programming as exclusive of all of these other strategies, but really thinking about how do we bring these different strategies together to have a more holistic response. And then working with communities to plan and lead programs. And so recognizing that, we can present these strategies that are working, but what do they mean within a specific context? How do they look? How are they adapted for that context? What else needs to be considered? What are the risks and possibilities of new behavior are really essential as we're starting to design or adapt programs to new settings. Well-trained, practiced, and supported facilitators. So, we want to start with transformation of facilitators themselves, starting with people who might already be more progressive or demonstrating the behaviors of interest, and then working with them on their own critical reflection and communication before implementing a program. Because what they do, what they model, is going to have an influence on what other people hear and see and start to determine as their own possibilities. And then finally, change takes time. So we're not only thinking about a program as a package, but we want to think about how long it's running, how frequently are people being exposed to new ideas, that one time isn't going to be enough. So what are the different forums in which they're hearing this and having to play with these different ideas? And then thinking about overall program length, right? So how long is the program? Are certain strategies more important at different stages of the program, or are they important throughout the program? So with that, I don't want to keep people over. So let's just go to the next slide. We have a bunch of resources that we've added onto this deck. And so on the next slide. So we'll include that in the response, but you can see these different resources that talk about looking at norms or bringing this evidence together. And next slide. And then finally, Lee and I both would like to thank you for being a part of this webinar today. We are presenting on behalf of the Prevention Collaborative, and you can find their site and all the different ways to keep up with their great work here. And with that, Kim, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you so much, Lee and Anjali. And I'm very sorry that we are not able to respond to all the questions, but this also means that there should be more conversations and more webinar on this. It's a very interesting and intriguing topic in our area of work. So on that, I just would like to thank all participants for staying with us with all these 90 minutes. Thanks, Anjali and Lee, again for the time to guiding us through this conversation, which is very interesting, helpful, and useful for our work. We will be having the next two last webinars in the next 2 or 3 weeks of March. I don't know if Johanna can put that up. I think the next topic I can remember is that the one is specifically on working with men and boys on violence preventions, linking to the conversation we have had here today on social norms. And the last one is linking the work on social protections and also violence prevention. Also, there have been a lot of questions around economic empowerment and economic security. So we hope to be able to discuss there. So hope you can come back and join us. But thank you so much, Lee and Anjali, for joining us, and thank you for Prevention Collaborative for partnering with us on this webinar series. So there you go, 22nd on men and boys and 29 on social protection. Please join us again, and thank you for staying with us, and wish you a very wonderful day and evening. Thank you. Have a good day.